Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 30, a thanksgiving for healing. Begin actually with the superscription. This occurs before verse 1, a psalm, a song at the dedication of the house, and then we read a psalm of David. Notice the word psalm is not repeated a second time, it's italicized. So, of David, or to David, or for David. Um, but notice the song of dedication. The Hebrew there, Mizmor, Shir, Hanukat, and then Ha-bait, the house. But the word that I want you to look at is that word for dedication, Hanukkah. We actually have our Jewish friends who celebrate the feast of Hanukkah. And it's a feast that looks just like this psalm looks like. It looks at the temple. And you'll remember that David, he wasn't allowed to build a temple, but he arranged for its plans, and he got the supplies together so that his son Solomon could come alongside after him and build a temple once David had died. But then many hundreds of years later, after the temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians and then rebuilt, and the Jews were back in the land, there was another pagan king who came in and desecrated that temple around 168 BC. And the Jews eventually drove out the desecrator, and they went back to the temple, and they cleansed it. It had been set up with pagan idols and things like that, and so they moved all those things out. They cleansed it, and they held a feast of dedication that our Jewish friends celebrate even to this day. They call it the Feast of Hanukkah, and that's the word that's used here. Now, I don't necessarily think this psalm is looking toward Hanukkah, because I don't think that had happened yet in David's day. But it's a great psalm for that purpose. It's by way of application. We can take it and we can look both at the building and the initial dedication of the temple in the days of Solomon, planned for by David, but also the later dedication when the temple had been cleansed and renewed in the days of the Maccabean revolt. Now that was the superscription. Now let's start the psalm itself. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have lifted me up. Notice what he says. I will literally, I will extol you, I will raise you up. That's what it means to extol. Not going to get into the Hebrew here. For you have lifted me up. And so there's two kinds of, there's a raising and a lifting. And because God has lifted up or he's raised up, he has lifted up the reader, he raises up God in worship, and have not let my enemies rejoice over me. There's been some bad things that have happened. He's going to get into that in just a moment. And so this is going to be a song of thanksgiving. Oh Lord my God, we're going to see that phrase repeated again at the end of the psalm. Oh Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and here it is, you healed me. This is why I called it a psalm of thanksgiving for healing, because he used the term for healing there. Oh Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. Now Sheol is a reference, and notice how our translators of the translation we're reading didn't really know how to translate that and do proper justice to it. So what they did is they took the Hebrew word and just put it in English letters, the same Hebrew word. The New Testament writers do the same thing. The New Testament writers comes to the term Sheol, and actually they put that Hebrew word with Greek letters into the New Testament. And so our translators here did the same thing. Now, what is Sheol? Sometimes, depending on the context, I suppose it can refer to hell, but more often it refers to just the place of the dead, in other words, the grave. And this is the idea: you've brought up my soul from the grave. I was about to die, from Sheol. And then he says that, notice, you have kept me alive that I would not go down to the pit. So this is parallelism, typical Hebrew parallelism, where you say it and then you say it again, but with different words. So Sheol, what is Sheol? It's the pit. What's the pit? It's Sheol. Two different ways of looking at the place of the dead. And now we get into the praise part. Sing praise to the Lord, you his godly ones. Now that term godly ones, the Hasidan. Notice that there's a part of that word that looks familiar to you, perhaps, the Hesed. Hesed, I like to Sometimes it's rendered in various translations as loving kindness. I like to translate that as a loyalty. So I would say here, you his loyal ones, and that works too, godly ones, his loyal ones, and give thanks to his holy name. So sing praise to him, give thanks to him. Again, this is a Thanksgiving psalm. Verse 5, for his anger is but for a moment. And I want you to see the parallelism here. His anger is but for a moment. His favor is for a lifetime. And so it's contrasting, not that anger and favor are the same thing, they're actually opposites. Anger, the anger of the Lord, it does happen. There are times where God's anger comes. Even against David, his anger had come. But that was only for a moment. By contrast, his favor, his grace, his loyalty is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. And so this picture, as the sun rises, and of course, if I think of David, I think of David's city, Jerusalem. You say, I thought Bethlehem was David's city. That was the city that he was born in, but Jerusalem was the city that really became the city of David. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. And that's really the same thing as saying his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for a lifetime. Yes, you may go through difficult times, and he's going to talk in a minute about how he went through difficult times, but then he came out the other end. At the end, there was a shout of joy. Verse 6, now as for me, I said in my prosperity, I will never be moved. One of my professors used to say, don't doubt in the darkness what you learned in the light, but make sure you learn the lessons in the light. This is my own comment on it. Make sure you learn the lessons in the light so that you have them when you are in the darkness. And this is what he describes here. In my prosperity, I said, I will never be moved. I'm with the Lord. When things are going good, it's easy to say things like that. Remember how Peter says to Jesus, deny you, I will never deny you. And then just a few hours later, who is that? Where he had spoken very strongly when things were good, but when things became bad, it's a more difficult situation. And so David also says, I'm just assuming David is the author here. Now as for me, I said in my prosperity, I will never be moved. And so what he's doing, he's beginning to tell the story for which he is giving thanks. Here it is. Verse 7, O Lord, by your favor, you have made my mountain to stand strong. And things were going good. But then you hid your face. I was dismayed. Notice the contrast. When things were good, by your favor, my faith was like a mountain. Remember how Jesus said, if your faith was like a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, be moved. The psalmist says, I was the mountain. But then it looked like God had gone away. You hid your face. And I went from being strong to being dismayed. So verses 1 through 5 were the call to give thanks. And now verses 6 and 7, we're seeing the story, but it's the story of a crisis that came where things had been good, but now a time of trouble. Was it illness? Was it some sort of calamity? We're not told the specifics. Now, because we saw the description of a healing, I'm treating it as though it was a sickness, but it might have been something else. But it was a crisis in any case. Then verse 8, to you, O Lord, I called, and to the Lord I made supplication. So he calls, he makes supplication, two different ways of saying the same thing. And here's what he says. Here is his prayer, the prayer that he prayed. What profit is there in my blood if I go down to the pit? Notice he says, Lord, if I die, what good is that? But notice how he phrases the question, what profit is there if I die? Will the dust praise you? Will it declare your faithfulness? That's sort of rhetorical questions. And the point that he's making, don't just heal me for my own sake, but for your sake, because if I go down to the pit, how are you going to profit, Lord? Not that the Lord really needs us, but that we give our praise and we declare God's faithfulness. And David said, I won't be able to do that if I'm not here. It reminds me a bit of what Hezekiah prays over in the book of Isaiah, where he says, Lord, I have committed myself entirely to you. And if I die, who's going to be doing that? And David prays the same way here. And so he says in verse 10, Hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. So notice there's a call to hear, there's a call to be gracious, and a call, be my helper. So we see the prayer. We start off with a call to give thanks, the story of the crisis, now the prayer. And finally, we're coming to the prayer's been answered. You've turned for me my mourning into dancing. Before bad things, instead of that strong mountain of faith, there had been mourning, but that's been turned around. And God came, he answered the prayer. Mourning goes to dancing. You've loosened my sackcloth and girded me with gladness. Notice how mourning and sackcloth are describing the same thing. Dancing and gladness, that's describing the same thing. These are two parallels, two different ways of saying the same thing. And we come finally to verse 12, that my soul may sing praise to you and not be silent. That's what he has said. Lord, how can I praise you if I'm down in the pit? But now God has redeemed him. He's brought him back, that my soul may sing praise to you and not be silent. Here's that second, O Lord my God. We saw it at the beginning of the psalm. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. And so it's a thanksgiving psalm, but it's a thanksgiving psalm that notes not just I'm going to give thanks to you, I will give thanks to you forever.